Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome to another edition of the Humble Skeptic podcast. I'm Shane Rosenthal. Early last month, I released an episode titled Jacob's Ladder, which focused on the contrast between Genesis 11 and Genesis 28. Genesis 11 tells the tale of man's failed attempt to ascend to the heavens. This is the famous story of the Tower of Babel, in which God came down and confused the language of those who attempted to bridge the gap between heaven and earth by the works of their own hands. By contrast, Genesis 28 tells the story of God's descent, not in judgment, but in grace, as he revealed himself to Jacob in the midst of a great stairway that did reach to heaven. In that scene, God promised to bless not only Jacob and his clan, but all the families of the earth through his offspring. As I see it, the contrast between Genesis 11 and Genesis 28 is quite likely the most important distinction to be found anywhere in the Bible. This appears to be the key point that Jesus made to Nicodemus when he said, quote, "No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man." The Tower of Babel story, of course, is about man's attempt to climb his way up to God on his own terms, whereas in contrast, Genesis 28 hints at ominous things to come when God would graciously descend to his people in the person and work of Christ. In his recent book, We Who Wrestle with God, Jordan Peterson reflects on the meaning of Genesis 11 and writes this: "The story of the Tower of Babel is in its essence another retelling of the ever-present temptations and dangers of hubris, a warning against humanity's marked proclivity to arrogance and misguided ambition. It cautions against the temptations of the Luciferian intellect, the desire to exceed the proper human place, to define good and evil themselves and attain the heights. In building a tower that reaches to the heavens, the engineers and technicians of Babel aimed to make a name not for God, but for themselves. In their pride, they claimed divinity and overstepped the bounds that kept them properly ensconced within the true cosmic and metaphysical order." Here's a clip of Jordan Peterson discussing this very topic on Joe Rogan's podcast.
In the Tower of Babel, men get together to build a tower that stretches to the heavens. And they want to do that to replace the transcendence. They want to replace the mystery of being with their own presumptions. And what happens is no one can talk to each other anymore. And that's the state we're in right now. That's why Matt Walsh can make a movie that's entitled What is a Woman? We can't even agree on that. That's the Tower of Babel.
It's worth noting that Babel and Babylon happen to be the same word in the original Hebrew. Thus, the Tower of Babel was likely an impressive ziggurat located somewhere in the area of ancient Babylon itself. In fact, if it weren't for the sake of tradition, we could just as easily refer to the Tower of Babylon when summarizing Genesis 11. I believe this is significant since whenever we discover the word Babylon from this point in the Bible forward, we're frequently confronted with this same theme of man's failed attempt to ascend to the heavens. Listen, for example, to these words from Isaiah 13 and 14. Behold, the day of the Lord comes to make the land a desolation. Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and when the Lord has given you rest from your hard service, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How are you fallen from heaven, O Daystar, son of the dawn? How you were cut to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Isaiah's reference to the day star was rendered by the translators of the Latin Vulgate as Lucifer, which many since that time have interpreted as a reference to Satan himself. In fact, the King James Version of this passage reads, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? But as the English theologian John Gill pointed out back in 1748, quote, this passage is not to be understood of the fall of Satan and the apostate angels when they were cast down from heaven, though there may be an allusion to it. But the words are a continuation of the speech of the dead to the king of Babylon. In Gill's view, the word Lucifer was merely a reference to what he called the phosphorus morning star, which shows that day is at hand, by which is meant not Satan, who is never in Scripture called Lucifer, but the king of Babylon, whose glory and majesty outshined all the kings of the earth. In general, I agree with Gill's interpretation, but when we recall that Babel and Babylon are essentially the same in Hebrew, I think it's also possible to see in Isaiah's words an allusion to the story of the Tower of Babel. Here's what I'm suggesting. What if the king in Isaiah's day is being subtly compared with his ancient counterpart, the one who originally built the famous tower, saying in his heart, I will ascend to the heavens, above the height of the clouds. While there doesn't seem to be any clue in Isaiah 14 that the passage relates to Satan, the parallels to Genesis 11 are indeed striking. However you slice it, the key point that needs to be emphasized is that here in this part of Isaiah's prophecy, the word Babylon is once again associated with the theme of man's prideful ascent to the heavens and the disastrous consequences that follow. The prophet Jeremiah also speaks of Babylon in similar ways. In chapter 51 of his prophecy, he writes that, quote, Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine, therefore they have now gone mad. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken, for her judgment reaches to the skies. It rises as high as the heavens. Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. No stone shall be taken from you for a corner, and no stone for a foundation, but you shall be a perpetual waste. Though Jeremiah lived during the time of the Babylonian captivity, with Isaiah he too was able to foresee the arrogant kingdom's eventual downfall. In Isaiah's words, Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant palaces. According to Jeremiah, quote, Though Babylon should mount up to heaven, and though she should fortify her strong height, it shall become a heap of ruins, the haunt of jackals, a horror and a hissing, without inhabitant.
So we're here at the Temple of Marduk in Babylon. The ziggurat remains are right out in front of us, and just laying around up here all over the place are bricks, of course. Here's another one. These stamped bricks are laying all over the place here. As we go here, you can see these are all wild animal tracks, just zigzagging all across this ancient site. The animal tracks are cutting through here. They're just everywhere. I mean, this place is littered with animal tracks. There's wolves, there's jackals, fox, hedgehogs, all kinds of wild animals, which of course makes sense because we're talking about this massive abandoned place, and so it's going to be infested with wild animals. That doesn't seem amazing today, but when that prophecy was given, this was the most amazing place on earth, the most amazing city, the capital of the world. And so to say that this magnificent city is going to become a habitation for wild animals was unthinkable at the time. And it just leaves such an impression on you when you visit it to see that that is exactly what it has become and what it is today.
That was a clip from a fascinating video by Joel Kramer titled Exploring Babylon and the Prophecies Against Her. I'll leave a link in the show notes for you to watch the entire thing. When looking at the ruins of Babylon, it seems clear that the oracles recorded both by Isaiah and Jeremiah came to pass just as they predicted. Now, when we pay close attention to the specific language that Jeremiah uses, once again we find intriguing parallels to the Tower of Babel story. Quote, "Though Babylon should mount up to heaven," the prophet says, "it will suddenly fall and become a heap of ruins." In the end, what did ascend above the clouds were not Babylonian bricks. According to Jeremiah, it was the judgment of Babylon that ended up reaching to the skies. In his prophecy, Jeremiah refers to Babylon as a destroying mountain, which provides a striking contrast to something Isaiah says in chapter 2 of his prophecy. Quote, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. He who takes refuge in Yahweh," Isaiah writes elsewhere, "shall possess the land and inherit his holy mountain." Once again, we find the same contrast that exists between the narratives of Genesis 11 and Genesis 28. Whereas the tower built by men invoked an ancient curse, when God appeared to Jacob on the heavenly stairway, he was providing the patriarch with the hint of the true way of blessing that would be revealed in the fullness of time. In the prophetic text that we've looked at, Babylon is described as a mountain that destroys the earth, whereas in contrast, the mountain of God gives life to the world and becomes a refuge for all nations. This contrast becomes even more explicit in the writings of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, the prophet was given the opportunity to interpret one of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. In his dream, the king of Babylon saw a great idol comprised of 4 different metals. The head was of gold, its chest and arms were silver, its torso and thighs were bronze, its legs and feet were iron, but the toes were mixed with soft clay. Then a stone cut by no human hand struck the image on its feet and broke it to pieces. The stone then grew to become a great mountain that filled the earth. After revealing the substance of the dream, Daniel told the king this: "You, O king, are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom strong as iron, and as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. It shall break into pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it shall last forever." In his classic book, Against Heresies, written in the latter part of the 2nd century, Irenaeus commented on Daniel's prophecy by saying that, quote, "Christ is the stone which is cut by no human hand, who destroys temporal kingdoms and introduces an eternal one. These things which were predicted, Christ has fulfilled." I'm convinced that this is one of the most amazing prophecies in the entire Bible. In fact, it's so clear that many secular scholars are forced to argue that the Book of Daniel is actually a much later composition, written at a time when many of the events described in the prophecy had already transpired. One of the biggest problems with this approach is that there are multiple references in Ezekiel's prophecy, the date of which no one disputes, to a famous person by the name of Daniel, who was known in that period for his wisdom and his ability to unlock secrets. Even if Daniel's prophecy had been written around 150 BC, it still ended up describing with brilliant clarity things that later took place, which is something that cries out for explanation. Most scholars are agreed that the 4 kingdoms of Daniel's vision refer to the 4 world empires of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. According to Daniel, Babylon wasn't the only kingdom that would fall. No, all the subsequent world empires would also be destroyed. Though Rome came to be known as the Eternal City, it too went the way of Babylon. But as Daniel predicted, the kingdom that God himself set up in the days of the Roman Empire is the one that will last forever. When the first-century Jewish historian Josephus reflected on the precision of Daniel's prophecies, he called him, quote, one of the greatest of the prophets, since he not only prophesied of future events as did the other prophets, but he also determined the time of their accomplishment. In fact, he went on to say that Daniel foresaw the fall of Babylon and the rise of successive world empires like Persia, Greece, and Rome. Josephus witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and argued that even this was a fulfillment of things written by Daniel. Quote, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. All these things did this man leave in writing, and any who read his prophecies and see how they've been fulfilled may thence discover how the Epicureans are in error, who cast providence out of human life and say that the world is carried along of its own accord without a ruler and curator. By the aforementioned predictions of Daniel, those men seem to me very much to err from the truth. The full name of the Jewish historian is Flavius Josephus, since he ended up being adopted by the Roman Emperor Flavius Vespasian, who allowed him to live and write at his own expense. Because of this, Josephus needed to be somewhat careful and guarded in his discussion of Daniel's prediction of the eventual fall of Rome itself. In his comments related to the stone cut by no human hand, which falls on the iron feet of the great statue and grows to become an ever-expanding mountain, Josephus writes this: Daniel also declared the meaning of the stone to the king, but I do not think it proper to relate it here, since I have only undertaken to describe things past or things present, but not things that are future. Yet if anyone be so very desirous of knowing the truth, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of things yet future, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. As we saw earlier in the writings of Jeremiah, Babylon was described as a destroying mountain that itself ended up being destroyed. But in Daniel's prophecy, the kingdom that God introduces in the days of the Roman Empire grows and expands to become a mountain that fills the entire earth. Though no stone had been found in Babylon for a foundation, no everlasting cornerstone, the stone cut by no human hand ultimately becomes the true foundation of God's eternal kingdom. Many scholars have noted some of the fascinating parallels that exist between the dream described in Daniel 2 with another vision recorded in chapter 7. Though the imagery is different, the overall message is the same. In Daniel 7, the prophet sees 4 great beasts, which also represent 4 successive kingdoms. The 4th beast, we're told, will be different from all the kingdoms and shall devour the whole earth. Here's the way that Hippolytus of Rome interpreted both of Daniel's visions in the early part of the 3rd century. Quote, the golden head of Daniel's image is identical with the first beast, by which the Babylonians were represented. The shoulders and arms of silver are the same with the bear, by which the Persians and Medes are meant. The belly and thighs of bronze correspond to the leopard, which signify the Greeks who ruled from the time of Alexander. The legs of iron correspond to the dreadful and terrible 4th beast with its iron teeth, by which the Romans who hold the empire now are meant. and the stone that strikes the image and breaks it to pieces, and that filled the whole earth, is Christ, who comes from heaven." End quote. Hippolytus wrote these words well before the fall of Rome, and yet even he was confident that Daniel's prediction would come to pass, because so much had already been fulfilled. It seems clear that the Roman Empire is indeed Daniel's fourth and final kingdom, since this is the kingdom into which Jesus himself was born. In my thinking, the 10 toes of the great statue in Daniel 2 and the 10 horns of the great beast in Daniel 7 both refer to the first 10 kings of the Roman Empire. Again, referring to the 10 toes in chapter 2, Daniel specifically writes, quote, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed." When Daniel first revealed these words to Nebuchadnezzar, Rome was an insignificant city-state ruled by various kings. But in 509 BC, kings were banished from the land as Rome became a republic. 5 centuries later, however, Julius Caesar changed history when he crossed the Rubicon and proclaimed himself dictator. This is when kingship officially returned to Rome, but since by this time Rome was now a world empire, her kings would now be known as emperors. In fact, the very name Caesar eventually became synonymous with emperorship itself, and was used by Roman rulers from the days of Julius onward, even if they didn't happen to belong to Caesar's household. Just as Daniel predicted, they did end up mixing with one another in marriage, and as history informs us, in many cases, that mixture didn't hold. Now, Jesus was born under Augustus, proclaimed the good news of the kingdom in the days of Tiberius, and taught his disciples to do the same after his death. Those same disciples went from Jerusalem and all Judea to Samaria and the ends of the earth during the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, and you can find a record of their proclamation in the book of Acts. In the end, Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed in 70 AD by the 10th Roman Caesar, Emperor Vespasian, and by that time Christianity had been firmly planted throughout the Mediterranean world. In short, the words of Daniel's prophecy were fulfilled in amazing detail. Babylon fell, the Persian Empire collapsed, the kingdom of Greece was shattered, and the Roman Empire is no more. And just as Daniel foretold, the kingdom that God set up in the days of the first 10 Roman emperors continues to grow and expand and fill the earth. Not only is Jesus the most famous person who has ever lived, but Christianity continues to be the #1 belief system anywhere on the planet. While it's true that Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world, it still happens to be a kingdom. Though the word Christ is often mistaken for Jesus' last name, in reality it simply means Messiah or anointed king. Christians, therefore, are dual citizens who follow the rules and customs of their own countries while also following Christ as their ultimate sovereign. They do this voluntarily rather than by compulsion, and sometimes at great cost. Daniel's imagery of a stone cut by no human hand, which grows to become a great mountain that fills the earth, makes clear that this is not a work of man, but of God. Idols, by contrast, whether made of metal or stone, are handmade. In fact, this is something that Isaiah specifically critiques in chapter 2 of his prophecy. The house of Jacob is being rejected, he says, because they are full of things from the east. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. The stone cut by no human hand, therefore, is the very antithesis of idolatry, just as Jacob's ladder is the very antithesis of the Tower of Babel. In some ways, Daniel's prophecies appear to be rooted in an earlier promise made to David in 2 Samuel 7. When Israel's king desired to build a house for God, the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, Would you build me a house to dwell in? In all the places where I have moved with the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar? The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will make you a house. When we examine the words of this significant prophecy, we discover the same contrast between that which we desire to build with our own hands and that which God promises to build for us. He's the one who bridges the gap between heaven and earth. He's the stone cut by no human hand and the cornerstone of the new international temple of God's own dwelling. As Peter says in his epistle, we, like living stones, have been incorporated into God's spiritual house. This is the house that God was promising to build for David. It wasn't a temple made of stone, since the temple Solomon built ended up being destroyed by the Babylonians. No, the true eternal temple promised to David is the one made of living stones like you and me, which is why Daniel described it as an ever-expanding mountain that fills the earth. Listen to how some of these threads come together nicely in Isaiah chapter 8. The Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense, and many shall stumble upon it. They shall fall and be broken. In this fascinating passage, Yahweh is the one who is described both as a sanctuary and a stone of offense that causes some to stumble. But this is precisely what was written about Jesus throughout the Gospels. In John 2, Jesus says, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it, referring to the temple of his body. He's the Word made flesh who tabernacled among us. And everywhere he went, it seems, he offended the sensibilities of the ruling class. At the end of his parable of the wicked tenants, Jesus cited the words of Psalm 118, which says, The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Essentially, he was claiming to be the rejected stone hinted at in the famous psalm that was sung every Passover, and the very fact that he was sent away and crucified serves as a vindication of that claim. The fact that he was betrayed and sentenced to execution didn't catch him by surprise, since it was at the very heart of his mission, just as we find outlined in Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servant. In verses 3 through 6 of Isaiah 53, the prophet writes this, He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. When I first discovered this portion of Scripture, it provoked a host of questions. When I discussed this passage with rabbis, I was essentially told that Isaiah's suffering servant was a kind of personification of Israel's own suffering across the ages. But many years later, I discovered an ancient Jewish paraphrase of Isaiah 53 that specifically identifies the suffering servant as Israel's Messiah. Quote, Behold, my servant the Messiah will be successful. Kings will be silent on account of him, and our iniquities will be forgiven on account of him, because he handed his life over to death. When we compare the language of Isaiah 53 to specific lines in Zechariah's prophecy, it becomes increasingly clear that the suffering servant is the Lord himself. Here's what we find in Zechariah 12. When they look upon me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. The one who is speaking in this mysterious passage is not the prophet Zechariah, but Yahweh himself. He's the one who is pierced. On that day, the text goes on to say, there shall be a fountain opened up for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. Sometime around 150 AD, Justin Martyr responded to the objection that Jesus couldn't be the Messiah because of his suffering and death. In his dialogue with Trypho and his Jewish companions, Justin writes this, The Scriptures foretold that he would be led away like a sheep and pierced, and when you know him whom you have pierced, your tribes shall mourn. Justin also went on to speak of the stone cut by no human hand from Daniel's prophecy, saying that it signified that this was not a work of man, but of God. according to Isaiah, the suffering servant would be pierced for transgressions, and according to Zechariah, the people would be cleansed of their sin by the piercing of Yahweh. So when the passages are read together, we begin to see more clearly that Isaiah's suffering servant is none other than Yahweh incarnate. He's the rock of stumbling and stone of offense, the rejected cornerstone that is marvelous in our eyes, the stone cut by no human hand, the Word made flesh who tabernacled among us, and the very bridge between heaven and earth. No one has ascended into heaven, Jesus famously told Nicodemus, except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. To put it succinctly, Jesus didn't merely come to show us the way, but in his great mercy, he descended to us because he is the way. Close to a decade before he died in 2020, I had the privilege of interviewing respected author and theologian J.I. Packer. And one of the things we discussed in our conversation was the fact that in many cases, it appears that Christians themselves are confused on these important matters. Rather than trusting the one who descended to us in mercy and grace, many believers seem to read the Bible as if it's merely a collection of moral instructions, which when properly applied, not only changes our life for the better, but allows us to ascend the great stairway leading to heaven. Here's how Dr. Packer responded to that way of seeing things.
Self-salvation is what all the religions of the world except Christianity are about. Christianity stands apart. It's divine wisdom, but it begins by contradicting all the things that the world, without Christianity, was taking for granted. And one of the things it contradicts is the idea that by taking upon ourselves religious disciplines, we can save ourselves. No, it can't be. The trouble goes deeper. And my hope is we'll come to see the teaching that pins us to the wall as helpless, unable to save ourselves, lost and ruined. If you talk about life change without focusing on the cross of Christ, followed by his resurrection, you weaken, indeed you falsify, what is being said about the God who changes your life. It is the news first. God has done something which saves us, transforms us, gives us hope, but it's all founded on what God did at the cross and in the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. That is the presentation that we need.
Folks, thanks for joining me for this edition of the Humble Skeptic podcast. If you'd like to investigate this topic further, be sure to check out some of the resources that I've provided in the show notes. Also, later this week, I'll be releasing a few new articles, including a post about some fascinating Babylonian inscriptions that have been discovered, along with other pieces related to the prophecies of Daniel and the identity of the mysterious character from the book of Revelation known as Babylon the Great. If you'd like to receive these upcoming posts, be sure to subscribe to the show at humbleskeptic.com, where you can find both free and paid options. The address once again is humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com, and I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.